We help organizations and teams understand what their culture picture looks like. Culture picture is going to come from your values, as long as they're well thought out. And then from those values, you're going to want to think about, okay, what are the behaviors that go along with those values? In other words, if you have a value of customer care, okay, cool. What does customer care look like when it's behaved, right? What are the behaviors that exemplify these values? You have to do that diligence. We help companies, organizations understand that and do that diligence. And from there, you can start to extract what attributes are required for those behaviors.
Hey everyone, welcome to the LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt. And today, I'm really excited to have this conversation we're about to have. I'm joined by Rich Diviney. Rich is a former Navy SEAL. He is an author. He is the founder of the Attributes Incorporated. And we're about to get a masterclass on leadership from an individual who has a wealth of experience both inside the military and in the civilian world as well. So Rich, thanks so much for coming to the podcast. I'd love to have you open with whatever you want the audience to know about you beyond that, and then we'll jump in.
Oh, well, thank you, Lars. It's great to be here. That was a great intro. I mean, 21 years in the Navy as a SEAL, was able to distinguish and distill a lot of lessons on not only leadership, but really probably high-performing teams, which, of course, leadership is a part of, and then, of course, performance and how and why we perform the way we do. So thrilled to be able to have been able to retire and write about that.
Well, let's go back. I mean, not all the way in the very beginning, but let's talk about kind of what drew you to the SEALs to begin with. What was it about the SEALs and that, kind of elite military career that, when did you know that was something that you wanted to pursue? And what was it about that you knew that was the path for your life early in your life?
Yeah, it was not too early. I grew up wanting to be a Navy pilot, a fighter jet pilot, and that really was what my twin brother and I both were bent on that, and that got us to ROTC at Purdue University. But I will say it was the early '90s that I first learned about Navy SEALs. Back in the '90s, very few people knew what Navy SEAls were, and I liked the idea as I researched them. I liked this idea of these being very elite. Troops that were not very well known. They were waterborne. They came from the water. I love the whole water thing. They did everything, like sea, air, land. So you did water stuff, but you also did skydiving and desert and Arctic. And I just kind of said to myself when I was in the ROTC program, I didn't want to wonder if I could always be a SEAL. So when it came time to select what I wanted to do, I picked SEALs just because I wanted to see if I could do it. And fortunately, I was able to make it through training because that's a big part. And then started my career in '96, and then it got very kinetic, obviously, after 2001, September 11th, and it was a very busy career all the way up until I retired in 2017.
Yeah. Well, let's spend a moment on the training program, as you mentioned, and I imagine most of our audience are familiar with Navy SEALs and their renowned training program and Hell Week, and now obviously that career, that field, and SEAL Team 6 specifically is pretty well established in lore. But the training program, I want to kind of focus on that because the program itself is really designed to not just test physical and kind of push beyond your physical limitations, which obviously you need to perform in the types of theaters and environments that you're working in, deployments, but also mental.
Yeah.
And those are equally as important. And so I'm curious to kind of get your perspective, obviously having gone through that, but also being involved in designing the training program for SEAL Team 6. How do you kind of assess both that physical and mental? And are there indicators kind of early in the program who is going to make it through and who is going to ring the bell and take themselves out?
Yeah, I'll answer the very last part of that question first. And the answer is no. There are very few indicators as to who's going to make it through. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is because people think SEAL training is about the physical stuff, and it's actually not. The physical stuff is simply a vehicle by which they get you to the mental stuff. They get you down to zero. And so this is why people also make the assumption that athleticism has something to do with being a Navy SEAL, and it doesn't. Being an athlete has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to make it through SEAL training. You have to be in shape enough to do the minimum requirements, but then you have to have the the grit, the mental acuity, the drive, all of those attributes to actually push through when they take you down to zero and make your life, miserable, and ask you, okay, now that you're at zero, even below zero, what do you have? Are you still going to be able to go? And that's really the key to the program. And I think this is where I began to really think about what we were actually looking for in terms of performance and how to define performance. A lot of people define performance as these visible skills, in the SEAL world, it's shooting, it's scuba diving, it's skydiving, right? But no one has to know how to shoot a gun. I'd never shot a gun before I went to, SEAL training, and I had done some scuba diving, but a lot of guys hadn't. I'd never skydived before that. So it was really about, hey, do you have what it takes to do the job? Let's figure that out first. Once we get that collection of individuals, then we're going to teach you the skills to do the job. So this was the impetus really of my trying to figure out the whole attribute stuff, because I wanted to define and articulate what these things were when it came to our performance.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the attributes for a moment. Like, was there a moment in your military career that this notion of, attributes over, say, perhaps skills, which I think typically we're trained to kind of key on skills. Was there a moment where that kind of light bulb went off and you're like, well, wait a minute, it's actually not about skills, it's about attributes?
Yes, and it's when I took over the training program for SEAL Team 6, and the leadership wanted me to more effectively articulate why certain guys were making it through and why certain guys weren't making it through, because all of the seemingly visible indicators weren't necessarily telling the story. Because everybody showing up to that program is a rock star in their own right, but when they're unable to make it through, and you can't say anything better than, well, you couldn't shoot very well, it's not sitting well with them or the leadership. And this is when I began to say to myself, okay, I think what we're looking for, it's obviously deeper than skills. The first light bulb, Lars, was it was about 2010 when I took over that training. I had gone through SEAL training BUDS in 1996. So it'd been many years since I'd been through SEAL training. And in SEAL training, just for your audience, in BUDS, you spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles and running around with those things and freezing in this drift zone. And by this time in 2010, I'd already been on hundreds of combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can tell you with certainty that never on one of them did I ever carry a big, heavy boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole. So it immediately started saying to myself, okay, well, in those moments, they weren't training us in the skills to be Navy SEALs. They were putting us in these environments to test and tease these qualities. And then it really kind of solidified. I was told a story by this old SEAL who had, from years back. And he said, the story goes that one day a kid showed up to Navy SEAL training, and he walked into the instructor's offices. He says, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor said, okay, well, you have to do a swim test. And the kid says, fine. So they take him out to the pool, and it's an easy test. It's 50 meters, so 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. Anyway, the kid gets all ready to go. He jumps in the pool, and he immediately sinks to the bottom of the pool. And he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches that end, and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. He comes up, he's gasping for air, right? Nearly drowning. The instructor looks at him and says, what the hell are you doing? And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. And at that point, the instructor pauses and he looks at the kid and says, that's okay, we can teach you how to swim. And so the idea is, why did the instructor say that? And he said that because he knew if this kid had the qualities, the attributes to show up to Navy SEAL training, and he didn't know how to swim, he had everything inside of him we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. And teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be the easy part. And so this really began to separate it for me. I said, okay, I need to start to look at this and bifurcate these two terms and understand, what are these qualities? What are they? How do we articulate them? And how do we look for them?
Yeah. Well, for SEAL Team 6 training specifically, is that separate than SEAL training? Like, do you become a SEAL and then the SEAL Team 6 is assembled through the different teams, or is it a team? Like, how does that work? Yeah.
So to go to that command, you have to already have been a SEAL for at least 5 years. Okay. You have to have stellar performance reviews, you have to have recommendations, psychological reviews, all that stuff, and physical tests. And then you are selected to go to the process, to the selection course. That selection course is about 9 months long. And it's during that selection course that you get about a 50% attrition rate. And so the idea is 50% of the top dudes are not making it through. And it really became incumbent on us to be able to articulate why that was with things better than the guy couldn't shoot very well. So yeah, it's a quite distinct and elite process, and it's a whole nother selection process.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you were also creating as you were evaluating kind of bringing your deployment experience into developing the training program for SEAL Team 6 was this notion of the mind gym.
Yeah.
And I would love to have you just expand on that. Like, how did you kind of come up with that idea? How did you implement it? How is it utilized? How is it maybe like a different path through which the process works?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so before I get into that, let me just correct one thing. I did not create or develop the training program. What I did was I helped articulate the current training. The training program was already developed. There was already unconscious genius woven throughout that. All I did was help articulate what we were doing. So it was easier to explain.
Okay.
But that aside, one of the other things that we were looking at the time was how do we get our operators to be better, faster, stronger? And there are a handful of us who felt like the gym wasn't the place. So it didn't matter. I mean, we didn't have to bench any more weight or run the mile any faster. So the physical development we didn't need any more of that. And we needed to actually start to train our brains and look at mental development. And so that's really when we began to explore and just throw a bunch of things against the wall in terms of, okay, what are some ways we can begin to develop a better working relationship with our brain? Part of this involved just learning more about our physiology, our autonomic nervous system, how we can shift between sympathetic and parasympathetic responses, what that means, how we can use breathing techniques and even visual techniques to do that. There are some tools we brought into the fray. There was cold plunges, but even cryotherapy we were looking at, the float tanks. I'm not sure if you've heard the isolation pods.
The sensory deprivation.
Tanks brought those in. Sports psychologist type stuff, breathing, HRV breathing, things like that. So really we began to just explore and experiment with a bunch of stuff. I would love to say that we brought it to a completion, but again, whenever you're in charge of anything in the military, it's usually only for 2 years max. And then you move on. And so whether or not those things have legs or traction depends on whether the folks behind you are believers. So I'm not sure where it stands now. I know it was very fascinating for us. And there's a bunch of cool stuff still there being used. I'm not sure how far they've taken the mental stuff, but that was the idea.
Yeah. What's interesting too, I think obviously in a role like being a Navy SEAL and being on the missions that they're in, you're not going to find a more stressful work environment to work under. And I'm curious to get your perspective. I imagine like the ability to deal with that stress, the ability to kind of slow down, the ability to remain calm under immense, life-threatening pressure. Part of that comes with reps, I would imagine, right? The first time you're in that situation, probably going to be different than the 5th and 10th and 20th time you're in that situation. But part of it, I'm sure, are also, techniques that can be learned, and I'm curious on the latter part, because I think obviously dealing with stress, and certainly not the level of stress that SEALs experience, but dealing with stress is something that everybody experiences in the workplace and in life at some point or another. Are there any tips and lessons from your experience and your training that you think would be valuable in the kind of, corporate or, non-military world that could be helpful?
Yes, there are. And in fact, it's a great timing. I just finished my second book. We're sending it to print this week. It's going to be out here hopefully in February. It's called Masters of Uncertainty. And I describe step by step what you need to do to, in fact, become a master of uncertainty. So in that book, I go through step by step. I'm not going to leave you hanging, though. Let me give you some distinctions.
I appreciate that.
One of the biggest distinctions is this idea that one has to be aware of what's called our own autonomic arousal. When we get stressed, fearful, anxious, our autonomic arousal goes up. And we begin, that amygdala starts getting tickled, and our brain begins to actually approach, depending on the levels of stress and anxiety, what we call autonomic overload or amygdala hijack. When that happens, what's happening is our frontal lobe, our decision-making portion of our brain, is actually taking a back seat to our limbic portion, and we begin to enter into a situation where we're acting without thinking. Okay, that in some cases of survival is great. I mean, you want to be able to run from a burning building without think about it, move out of the way of the oncoming train or run from the bear, whatever that is. So in some cases, you want your body to act faster than you might have to think. In most cases, however, during stress and challenge and uncertainty, we want to have our frontal lobe, our conscious decision-making brain involved in the process. And this is what we get very good at. I think there's a nature-nurture element to the guys who actually make it through SEAL training. All of us have have some of it, and we just hyper-develop it. But it's this idea that we can control our autonomic arousal. We don't get aroused very quickly, maybe when you compare us to normal people. We keep that frontal lobe engaged, and then we do a very specific process, a process I call moving our horizons, okay? Moving horizons means, now all of us as human beings have done this before because it's going to sound familiar. Moving horizons just means that in any situation or environment of uncertainty, challenge, or stress, we immediately ask ourselves, what can I focus on and what can I control in this moment? We pick something and we move towards that. And we block out everything else. And as soon as we hit that goal, we get a dopamine reward in our brain, right? And we just come back out and we say, okay, now what? Now what am I going to focus on? And we move towards that. This is a process that's neurologically, it's founded in neuroscience and neurology, because what happens in our brains in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, well, really in any situation, our brain are looking to define an environment through three factors. Okay, those three factors are duration, pathway, and outcome. Okay, duration, how long this is going to take. Pathway, what's my route, in or out, and then outcome, what's the end state. If we are in absence of one or more of those three things, we begin to feel stressed and anxious. Uncertainty is seeding itself into the system. So what moving horizons does for us is it allows us to create our own duration, pathway, outcome, our own DPO for short. Once we create our own DPO, we immediately have something to focus on. We move towards it, and then we pick something else. So we never, ever, in the SEAL world, you never, ever get overwhelmed by a bunch of stuff. We're always focusing in. A great example would be, one of the things we do in the SEAL teams at certain levels is we do these hey-ho skydives, high altitude, high opening parachute jumps. This is where you go up to about 20,000, 22,000 feet. You jump out of the airplane with oxygen and night vision, all that stuff. You count to 4, you pull your chute. So you're opening up around 20,000 feet. And then you're navigating to where you want to go. And you're staying in stack. There's a lot that goes into this evolution, especially when you're going to an unknown drop zone, and then you have a mission. You have a mission behind that. You're all looking. There's a whole ton of stuff. And I remember just my buddies and I thinking about this, and we were talking about it one day, and all of us agreed that when we're in that plane and that door opens up, and we're getting ready to do this 20,000 foot jump into this mission, this whole thing, there's only one thing we're thinking about in that moment, and that thing is nail the exit. Okay, because if you don't get out of that airplane at a good, stable position, your parachute's not going to open properly, right? So the one thing you're worried about is nailing the exit. Once you nail the exit, the next thing is open my parachute. After that, the next thing is get on heading. And the next thing is do whatever, right? So it's this idea that we can actually effectively start moving our horizons in any environment. It's the neurological equivalent of eating the elephant one bite at a time.
Yeah.
We can do that in any environment of uncertainty just by calming ourselves to a degree where we can ask some questions about what we can focus on and focus on things and move towards it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the preview in the book, and I'll be excited to check that out. But I think, again, it makes it more accessible. It also allows you to kind of establish some wins by moving the horizon that you can build on. So it's like, okay, this whole thing is overwhelming, but I could do this part. Now I can do this part, and now I can do this part. So you're kind of chunking the larger mission into smaller pieces.
And you're in fact engaging a dopamine reward system in your brain.
Yeah.
As soon as you chunk something and make a goal, as soon as you hit that wicket, you actually create a dopamine reward, which allows you to then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again.
Okay. I want to come back to your first book.
Yes.
So the first book, The Basis of Your Company, the attributes. How did you land on 25 for one? And then what was the process that you went through in which you kind of leveraged your experience in the teams to kind of identify what were those 25 attributes for success?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, I knew there were more than 25, but 25 seemed like a good number, and you don't want to write a 500, 600 page book. So I landed on 25 in terms of what I felt were the most important at that time for optimal performance. So if you're in these times of stress, challenge, uncertainty. So that was the way I kind of looked at it. And then I began to say, and now of course we have 41, and I know you took the assessment and you rated on 41 attributes. But the idea was I looked at these attributes and began to ask some very simple questions. First of all, the way you determine whether or not it's an attribute or a skill, you ask yourself, can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is no, it's probably or if the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to shoot a gun and hit a bullseye. Well, that I could take you out the range and teach you how to do that in 2 hours. That's the skill. Or you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to be more patient. I can't teach you how to do that, right? It has to be self-developed. So that's number one. And then number two is you can see attributes in small children, right? So anybody who has kids or knows kids, or little kids will agree with me when I say there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient. So these attributes there's a nature nurture. Now you can certainly develop attributes over time and experience, but there's a nature nurture element to that. And so I began to look at what are those qualities that meet those definitions, meet those criteria, and then also are they in their most elemental form? Okay, so in other words, people have said, is self-awareness an attribute? And the answer is no, because self-awareness is a combination of a couple things that create self-awareness. So it's a combination of the attribute of humility. It's a combination of the attribute of curiosity. So are they in their most elemental forms to kind of determine this list? And that's where we began to look at the list and determine the list. And of course, get with psychologists and psychometricians and make sure we're doing the diligence there. But that was the idea. And thinking about how these match up in our own unique performance picture starts to identify how and why we perform the way we do, which makes it really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that was interesting is, you've worked with a range of different, companies and organizations from, police departments and fire departments on, identifying the attributes necessary for success in that role. And then also building kind of hiring methodologies and processes through which to identify those. And I'd love to just pick any example. I won't even prescribe that, but a company or an agency or an organization that you worked with, what's your process for kind of coming in and identifying, understanding, what are the unique attributes for success in that environment? And then how do you build kind of an interview process in order to, gauge that and assess that with potential candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what we've been able to do is we help organizations and teams understand what their culture picture looks like. Culture picture is going to come from your values, as long as they're well thought out. And then from those values, you're going to want to think about, okay, what are the behaviors that go along with those values? In other words, if you have a value of customer care, okay, cool. What does customer care look like when it's behaved, right? What are the behaviors that exemplify these values? You have to do that diligence. We help companies, organizations understand that and do that diligence. And from there, you can start to extract what attributes are required for those behaviors. And the process we put them through allows us to basically create this list of attributes and then order them in priority order. So the ones that come up the most become obviously the top priority for those organizations, and then so on and so forth. And what that tells organizations and teams is that, hey, every team and organization has its own unique list of what attributes are required to be a part of that team or organization. The attributes required to be part of a Navy SEAL team, that list is going to look different than the attributes required to be part of a teacher team or surgical team or whatever, sales team. So we help them determine that list. And then once they know those attributes that they prioritize, we can help them understand, okay, how do we start applying those to specific roles in the organization? Okay, the attribute list for a CEO is going to look slightly different than the attributes it looks for a COO or a director or a mailroom person. Now, they're still going to come from the same cluster of that master list we helped create, but it's going to look a little different. Knowing that is the key to start to find and hire, first of all, performance evaluate, because you can performance evaluate inside of your own teams, which we help do. That's what the assessment helps us do. How are we doing together as a team? But then how do we then look specifically to hire for these attributes and not just skill? Because if we fall into the trap of hiring for just skill, we're at risk of creating what I call the dream team paradox. In other words, you find all the best people at the best things, you put them all together expecting them to be the best, and what happens usually is they're the best, they're really good when things are going well, but as soon as things don't go well, the team turns toxic because you haven't taken the time to work on and look at the way they interact with each other. That's where attributes fall in. So understanding what you're looking for is critical, and then you can, in any hiring process, you can either create experiential events, right? I'm gonna have this person do something, or I'm going to interview them in a way that you must inflict or induce a little bit of stress, challenge, and uncertainty in the environment so that you can actually tease out these attributes. And so the couple quick examples, experiential example would be if you and I wanted to figure out find someone who's good at sales. candidate comes, we say, okay, on a Friday, we say, come in Monday, you're going to sell us this pencil. Okay. Person comes in Monday, the person proceeds to just wow us with their pencil presentation. We're like, oh my gosh, that's the best thing we've ever seen. The problem is we would not have learned very much. All we would have learned is that person's really good at going back home, preparing a presentation and giving a presentation. So instead, what we do is we say on Friday, come in Monday, you're going to sell us this pencil. They come in Monday morning to say, hey, the plan's changed. Okay. You're no longer selling us the pencil. You're going to sell us this coffee mug. Okay. And by the way, there's no audio visual. So just roll with it. Now, what we're going to do, you and I are going to make a very deliberate decision to divorce ourselves from skills assessment, because what we're about to see is going to be ugly, but we're not looking at skills anymore. We're looking at attributes. How does this person behave? Do they make light of it? Do they make things happen? Do they just go with it? Or do they kick the ground or kick the dirt, make excuses, spiral downward? That's when we're looking at attributes. Attributes are on the periphery of what we're seeing. It's not always directly what we're seeing. So that's an experiential way. And then a way you can just inflict a little bit of stress into a question is just to ask a question that puts someone doesn't necessarily expect, right? Make someone think about pulling themselves out. An example would be, I was working with a group of guys, a company in Colorado. They were a construction company, awesome folks. And they were what I call Uber patriots. There were flags everywhere. They were pro-military. It was awesome. It was great to work with them. Great guys. One of their primary attributes they were looking for was open-mindedness. And I remember the CEO saying, hey, Rich, how can I ask a question to see or gauge someone's level of open-mindedness? I said, well, let me give you an example. He said, okay. I said, give me 3 reasons right now to burn the American flag. And you can see, I asked him that. He almost had an aneurysm when I asked him that, right? Because he was like, because I was trying to do is pulling him out of his fishbowl to see if he could look from a different angle and look into the fishbowl. Just a real quick example of how you can take a question, you can reframe it, you can re-ask it to pull someone out of what they were expecting and start to see these attributes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I think when you frame it that way, it takes somebody out of their comfort zone. And I imagine what you're also assessing is sometimes you're probably going to situations where a company or a team may state that these are our values and these are what we think the attributes are. And as you do your research, you're actually finding, well, this is what you may be saying they are, but actually they're over here. And I think it's important to be able to diagnose that as well.
Well, one of the things we do, by the way, because that's a great point, is we help organizations. We overlap the work we do with the values often with our assessment tools. So we take some of the very top performers of an organization, we put them through our assessment, we see what attributes would they have in common, what make them great parts of that organization, and we match them with what we're getting from the values. Because and luckily we've had a lot of situations where they do match. Yeah. Sometimes there's an incongruency, and that begins to turn the wheels and say, okay, wait a second, where might we be going wrong here? And it's a really good project.
Yeah. Well, there's one more aspect of leadership I want to get your thoughts on that you've written about, which is dynamic subordination.
Yeah.
And I'd love to have you just expand on that a little bit, because I found that very interesting. And I think particularly as a leadership style and approach, it resonated with me. I'd love to have you just expand on that for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Dynamic subordination is quite literally the way high performing teams task organize, right? So instead of the hierarchical pyramid model or the flat model where no one outranks anybody, or even the servant leadership model with the upside down pyramid, it's not that. It's really, you can think of it like an amoeba or a blob. And what that implies is that a team understands that challenges and issues and problems can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to that problem, the most capable, immediately steps up and takes lead, and everybody follows. The environment shifts and someone else steps up and everybody follows. And it's a dynamic swap between leader and follower. I also call it alpha hopping, where that alpha position just hops to wherever it needs to be. This is what the best teams do. And I always say I was an officer in the SEAL team. And I did hundreds of combat missions. I was in charge of every single one of those. It didn't mean I was always being supported. In fact, most of the time I was opposite. I was supporting other people, breachers, snipers, whatever. Sometimes the environment would shift and they'd be supporting me. But the dynamic subordination model allows for a team to understand that we all have a responsibility to lead at some point. We have to be ready to step up when it's not our turn, and then step back and to support when it's not our turn. And that's how a team plays the long game of high performance.
Yeah. And also requires a lack of ego, I think, from the, on paper, the team leader, right? I think most organizations will have more of that structured org chart and hierarchy. And so, a leader being successful of a team like that knows when they need to step up and when they need to step back. And that is not a trait that all leaders have, but I think is important, because again, it makes sense why that makes, the most high performing teams special, because when to play a role that isn't necessarily having to be out front every time.
That's right. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. Well, I would love to. I know, we have an hour. I do have a few questions that came in from the audience I want to cover, but you were also very kind enough to let me go through the assessment itself to be able to kind of understand my own attributes. I've had a chance to review that, review the findings. I found it very interesting, and I'd love to maybe we could just spend a couple of minutes, breaking that down. I would love to just get your sense of like how you interpret that.
Yeah. Let's do it real quick. So I have yours. I'm looking at yours now. So do you have your top 5 in front of you? So what we'll do is you got rated on all 41.
Yes.
And it gives you a list from 1 to 41. Now, again, for everybody to understand, there's no judgment here. There's no good or bad. It's really just how we individuals prioritize these attributes in our behavior. And what we're going to look at the top 5 and the bottom 5, because that begins to give us some very distinct behavioral tendencies and starts to point to why and how we perform the way we do. So if we look at your top 5, which are caring, discipline, conscientiousness, self-efficacy, and humor, okay, let me just ask you, when you look at those as your top 5, what are some ways that you can think of or explain or describe how those being your top 5 have been in service to you, have served you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly self-efficacy. And if you see me looking down, I'm actually looking to pull up the report as we go. But, self-efficacy has been important. I mean, I've been an entrepreneur of a business that I've been running for 10 years. I put myself through college. I had to take care of, I was a caregiver for an ailing parent in high school. And so I learned early on. I also had a father who kind of instilled that work ethic. He had me, I grew up in Florida. The legal age to work in Florida was 14. He pulled strings at a local grocery store to have me working, go through training before my 14th birthday so I could actually be working on my birthday. So, I think that certainly, that stood out and resonated with me. Humor as well. I think, again, being somebody who's been through a lot of different personal scenarios in my life with, family and loss and resilience, humor has always been something that I've been able to lean on to kind of get me through it and rally teams behind difficult times. And, I think I'm able to have a sense of a bigger picture where even when a time is difficult, like having that perspective of going through difficult times, like it allows you a level of perspective that I think is a gift and not everyone has. So I can find the humor even in difficult situations. And I think that has certainly been helpful.
Yeah. I would agree. I think there's some powerful combinations in this top 5. Your self-efficacy, your discipline. Obviously, that self-efficacy is self-starter. That means you're a starter, and the discipline that you understand what's required to do it. You're conscientious, which means you're reliable, you work hard. And then you add humor to that mix. Humor is always a good thing because you keep it as a levity and caring. And I mean, even creating a humorous atmosphere is a caring act as well. So I think it all blends. So the next question I'll ask you, because again, this attribute stuff is about honest introspection, is when you look at the top 5, what are some ways that having these as your top 5 have not served you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think self-efficacy and determination. Sometimes it's easy to go down the wrong path. Sometimes it's easy to, I tend to get excited by an idea and go after it. I don't always, analyze as much. So that has been a plus, but it's also gotten me in trouble, sometimes and had me chasing things I didn't need to chase. So I think that has come into play. And I think, humor, you've got to know when it's appropriate to find humor. And,
you have to be matched with emotional awareness too, right?
Yes. And I think I try to do that, but I'm not always successful. So there's, I certainly find myself, laughing probably in some inappropriate moments that have gotten me in trouble. So yeah, I would say that those have been the other sides of those strengths.
And you can see, so just for everybody to understand that, again, the attribute stuff is not, there's no judgment here. It's really, how can I define and describe and understand my performance better? I think you're spot on, and we're going to look at your bottom 5 here in a second. But one of your low bottom 5 is patience. Okay, so you are naturally impatient. So when you're naturally impatient, that might your whole self-efficacy and discipline might make you move faster than maybe you should instead of taking that pause. So again, these are ways you say, hey, my combination of self-efficacy and discipline on high and my low patience have actually propelled me to a lot of success. However, there's some blind spots I got to be aware of. There's some times where it actually hasn't served me. And this is why we have to do this analysis. So real quick, we'll just look at the bottom 5 because we can ask the same 2 questions. how has having these as your bottom five, and I'll just read for the audience: persistence, extroversion, patience, discernment, and authenticity. How has these being your bottom five been in service to you? How have they served you?
I think in terms of how they serve me in a positive way, like certainly the lack of patience has allowed me to move fast. Mm-hmm. And in certain situations, that has been an asset. But I think of those five, like that was the one that I know I'm very self-aware about that aspect of. And I was like, I wasn't surprised to see that there. But I think that is also kind of, and I appreciate your framing around like, there's no judgment around are these good or bad. It's more of like, an awareness of how you operate so you can kind of model accordingly. And I think that patience piece is like really for me, like the double-edged sword.
It is.
Yeah.
And I would say like, so a couple other things. So discernment, you're not necessarily a detailed person, but that serves you because that allows you to go full throttle at certain things and not worry about details. You don't get caught up in the details. Yeah. How might that be a blind spot? Is you don't get caught up in the details. You miss details, right?
Yes.
And so I'm low on discernment as well. And so I recognize in our business, both my wife and I, we're both low on discernment. Our COO is high on discernment. So every contract that comes through us, my wife and I just pass to Jenny because we know she's going to notice things that we miss. Yeah. So there's an advantage to both. Even authenticity. People sometimes see authenticity as a low and they're like, what the heck? All that means is you're actually very good at going into environments and reading that environment and being a chameleon in a way that allows you to relate much quicker than someone else.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're inauthentic and you're just, it means that you can chameleon fairly quickly in different environments with different groups and be very successful. What a blind spot might be is sometimes it might be difficult for others to know the real Lars, or sometimes at the worst case might be difficult for Lars to know the real Lars. Right? Yeah. So you have to figure that stuff out in terms of how it might help serve or not serve.
It's interesting. I think when I saw that and extroversion in my bottom five, I was a little surprised by those initially, but as I kind of thought more about it, in my world, like in my kind of work, like obviously I host a podcast, I do conference speaking, I go to events. And so there's an aspect of my work and world that will require me to kind of be operating at a 10 of 10. Mm-hmm. Right? Am I a 10 of 10 at all times? No, I am not. No. Right? So I think
let me qualify that for you. Yeah. I'm also low on extrovert. I'm more of an introvert, and I do public speaking. Extroversion, introversion has nothing to do with your ability to be social. It has to do with where you get your energy from. So
I see.
You, like me, will go and do these events and you'll be in front of a ton of people. That's fine. You'll just, at the end of the day, you just exhausted. You want to be by yourself for a little while. You need to recharge. Or this podcast stuff. I mean, we are on a one-on-one conversation. Yeah, there's tons of people listening, but as far as we're concerned, it's a one-on-one thing. And that the introverts tend to get more energy off of those one-to-one things or those very small groups. Whereas the extroverts, my wife, she's an extrovert, right? We can go to a cocktail party with 100 people for 3 hours, and both of us are very socially adept. We'll be fine, except at the end, all I want to do is go to bed, and she can't get to sleep because her battery's so full, she's buzzing, and I'm just drained. That's how it works.
Yeah, no, that's interesting framing, and relatable for me for sure.
Yeah. So that's just a quick way to kind of explore that, and you can kind of take a look at again how these stack from 1 to 41. You can see, okay, I can see how these begin to relate to each other and how it defines my performance, both in every day, but also especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, where can our audience learn more about the attributes? Where can they take this assessment themselves? Where can they learn more about your consulting and coaching services? Where, somebody's watched this, they're like, okay, I need more. Where do they go from here?
Well, the best place is just theattributes.com. So www.theattributes.com. They can find all of our stuff there. However, we're also going to give you and your audience a special code. So if they want to take the assessment, it's a coupon. They get a discount for taking the assessment, and you can find the assessment on that website as well. I think my team's going to send you some links as well. So they'll be able to check out that assessment at a discount, and then check out everything we have going on from our website. So, and of course, the new book's coming out soon. So that'll be up there too. And then maybe you and I have another conversation too. So
I think so. On the show notes, I'll include a link to the book, the original book, The Attributes, book 1. I'll include the discount code and the link. And I know we're almost at time. I want to squeeze in a couple audience questions.
Yeah, please.
It's not every day that our audience gets a chance to, ask the, Navy SEALs, former, leader of the process for selection for SEAL Team 6. And some of these actually, obviously most of these questions are coming from civilians, but I think they cross over to both worlds. And the first one is, Would love to hear any strategies you have for rebounding from a failure and how to reset from that.
Yeah, so rebounding from failure is resilience. That is the attribute of resilience. And again, if I get knocked off baseline, how quickly and effectively can I get back to baseline? It takes practice. I will give you a tool that one of my favorite CEOs gave us, and he once said it was something his grandfather taught him. It was called the 2-minute rule, and the 2-minute rule goes like this: if something bad happens, then you take 2 minutes and you kick the dirt, you swear, you feel sorry for yourself, whatever you want to do. As soon as that 120 seconds is up, you get back to work. Same thing goes when something great happens. Something great happens, you take 2 minutes, you celebrate, you rest on your laurels a little bit, you do whatever you need to do, and after 120 seconds, you get back to baseline, you get back to work. Now, the 2-minute rule is a great way to practice resilience. It is obvious that there are some things that happen to us that take a lot more than 2 minutes to recover from, but you can use the 2-minute rule on a daily basis for just those, what I call little tragedies, right? The bad meeting at work, the traffic jam, the spat, with your loved one, whatever that is. You use the 2-minute rule for those. You exercise that resilience muscle. Resilience is all about, can I get back to baseline, which means that thing that happened doesn't trigger me anymore. I'm fine. I'm over it. Okay. Again, if you're having trouble with resilience, especially with the big stuff, go get help. Don't try to do it on your own. Okay. But you can use the 2-minute rule for practicing on those little tragedies. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the term little tragedies, but also appreciate the actionable tip. Next question is, do you know upfront, like obviously as a leader, being able to give feedback and as a person in any role, being able to receive feedback is critically important. Do you know upfront who would be good at receiving feedback and who would be terrible? Like, were there any tells or triggers when you think about people going through, whether it was, training or just people on deployment with you?
Yeah, while I will concede that there are people who it's harder for them to take feedback. I will concede that. However, I do believe that the ability to take and receive feedback is more environmentally based than it is individually based. In other words, if you create an environment where feedback is constant, the people in that environment begin to be very good at taking it and receiving it and giving it. And there's no ego there. There's no maliciousness. It's all about just getting better as the team. And the SEAL teams, this is the way it was. And of course, I will also say, the SEAL teams, the environment is very intense. You have a lot of things that are trying to kill you, not just enemy. I mean, the environment is trying to kill you. Water, the ocean is going to kill you if you turn your back on it. If you jump out of the plane at 20,000 feet and you don't have your shit together, there's going to be bad news. So we were constantly in an environment where feedback was absolutely necessary and had to be very fast and instant because it was all about getting better. But even in regular teams, both personally and professionally, we can create a process, an environment. We called it the AAR, the after action review, where after anything you do, good or bad, you just say, okay, let's stop. Before we do anything, let's ask ourselves 3 questions. What went right? What went wrong? And what can we do better? All right. And let's have that conversation. And if you start seeding that environment, and of course, as the leader behaving that, you got to go first in some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Then you will begin to create this dish inside of which feedback is constant and productive and very valuable, and the team starts to skyrocket in its performance.
Okay. All right, Rich. Last question. Especially this kind of goes back to your time on the teams. Obviously, going through the selection process to become a Navy SEAL, you're one of the elite warriors on the planet. Joining an organization like SEAL Team 6, you are the very tip of the spear. And so the question was around, how does one retain humility and aspirations to be better when everyone is telling you that you're the best?
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, no one's telling you that you're the best inside of the community.
All right.
So, that's number one. So that's interesting. The number 2 thing is the environment is never telling you you're the best. The environment will again, like I said, will kill you if you turn your back on it. So humility is ever present in that environment. But I think the third thing is something that I discovered early on, and it's what I call a healthy imposter syndrome. And what I mean by that is when my BUDS class, my SEAL training class was back in '96. I mean, 90% of the dudes don't make it through. It's a 90% attrition rate. So I think we started with 170 or so. We graduated 38. And I remember at graduation looking around me, I'm like, how the heck am I still here? Like, what is it? Like, I feel almost like almost not inadequate is a strong word, but I feel like, why am I still here? And that was the first indication for me to say, you know what, I just need to step up my game. I need to always step up my game. I need to always be learning, always be doing better, because I don't want to let my teammates down. And so I think the way you keep yourself in that learner's mind, that humble mind, is to always look around you and say, what can I be doing better for those around me? I always have something to learn.
Yeah.
And then recognize that the environment's not going to do you any favors either. So yeah, I was, certainly, of course, as the SEAL, I mean, again, no one knew what the SEALs were until maybe the mid 2000s, and people started like, oh, Navy SEAL. So we were the anonymous guys for, a long time. Right. And then once, of course, the notoriety started, you get a lot of that, oh gosh, you guys are the best. But that never seeded into your day-to-day performance. It just didn't. The environment was too intense to be able to do that. And I would encourage people to remember that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Rich, I really appreciate you taking the time to give us a window into the attributes. I definitely recommend you checking it out. The assessment itself was very enlightening, and just keep up the great work. Congrats on the second book, and we may very well have to do a round 2 once that comes out. So congrats again on that.
Be happy to. Lars, thanks so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
All right. Thanks, Rich.